Now, to us of the initiated, or to us of the wider outlook, there is nothing incredible in the thought of shoemakers in other worlds, but I suspect that this characterization is tactical. This object of work stone, or this shoemaker's lapstone, was made of Vesuvian lava, Dr. Johnstone Lavis thinks. Most probably of the lava flow of 1631 from the La Scala quarries. We condemn most probably as bad positivism. As to the men of position who had accepted that this thing had fallen from the sky, I have now obliged them to admit their mistake, says Dr. Johnstone Lavis. Or, it's always the stranger in Naples who knows La Scala lava better than the natives know it. Explanation: that the thing had been knocked from, or thrown from, a roof. As to attempt to trace the occurrence to any special roof, nothing said upon that subject. Or that Dr. Johnstone Lavis called a carved stone a lapstone, quite as Mr. Simons called a spherical object a cannonball, bent upon a discrediting incongruity. Shoemaking and celestiality. It is so easy to say that axes or wedge-shaped stones found on the ground were there in the first place, and that it is only coincidence that lightning should strike near one, but the credibility of coincidences decreases as the square root of their volume, I think. Our mass instances speak too much of coincidences, but the axes or wedge-shaped objects that have been found in trees are more difficult for orthodoxy. For instance, Arago accepts that such finds have occurred, but he argues that, if wedge-shaped stones have been found in tree trunks, so have toads been found in tree trunks. Did the toads fall there? Not at all bad for a hypnotic. Of course, in our acceptance, the Irish are the chosen people. It's because they are characteristically best in accord with the underlying essence of quasi-existence. Mr. Arago answers a question by asking another question. That's the only way a question can be answered in our Hibernian kind of an existence. Dr. Botting argued with the natives of the Santal Parganas, India, who said that cut and shaped stones had fallen from the sky, some of them lodging in tree trunks. Dr. Botting, with orthodox notions of velocity of falling bodies, having missed, I suppose, some of the notes I have upon large hailstones, which, for size, have fallen with astonishingly low velocity, argued that anything falling from the sky would be smashed to atoms. He accepts that objects of work stone have been found in tree trunks, but he explains that the Santals often steal trees, but do not chop them down in the usual way, because that would be to make too much noise. They insert stone wedges and hammer them instead. Then, if they should be caught, wedges would not be the evidence against them that axes would be. Or that a scientific man can't be desperate and reasonable too. Or that a pickpocket, for instance, is safe, though caught with his hand in one's pocket, if he's gloved, say, because no court in the land would regard a gloved hand in the same way in which a bare hand would be regarded. That there's nothing but intermediateness to the rational and the preposterous, that this status of our raticinations is perceptible wherein they are upon the unfamiliar. Dr. Botting collected 50 of these shaped stones said to have fallen from the sky in the course of many years. He says that the Santals are a highly developed race, and for ages have not used stone implements, except in this one nefarious convenience to him. All explanations are localizations. They fade away before the universal. It is difficult to express that black rains in England do not originate in the smoke of factories. Less difficult to express that black rains of South Africa do not. We utter little stress upon the absurdity of Dr. Betting's explanation, because if anything absurd, everything's absurd, or rather, has in it some degree or aspect of absurdity. And we've never had experience with any state except something somewhere between ultimate absurdity and final reasonableness. Our acceptance is that Dr. Betting's elaborate explanation does not apply to cut stone objects found in tree trunks in other lands. We accept that for the general, a local explanation is inadequate. As to thunderstones, not said to have fallen luminously, and not said to have been found sticking in trees, we are told by faithful hypnotics that astonished rustics come upon prehistoric axes that have been washed into sight by rains, and jump to the conclusion that the things have fallen from the sky. But simple rustics come upon many prehistoric things: scrapers, pottery, knives, hammers. We have no record of rusticity coming upon old pottery after a rain, reporting the fall of a bowl from the sky. Just now my own acceptance is that wedge-shaped stone objects formed by means similar to human workmanship have often fallen from the sky. Maybe there are messages upon them. My acceptance is that they have been called axes to discredit them, or, the more familiar a term, the higher the incongruity with vague concepts of the vast, remote, tremendous unknown. In Notes and Queries 2-8-92, a writer says that he had a thunderstone which he had brought from Jamaica. The description is of a wedge-shaped object, not of an axe. It shows no mark of having been attached to a handle. Of 10 thunderstones figured upon different pages in Blinkenberg's book, 9 show no sign of ever having been attached to a handle. 1 is perforated. But in a report by Dr. C. Leemans, director of the Leiden Museum of Antiquities, objects said by the Japanese to have fallen from the sky are alluded to throughout as wedges. In the Archaeological Journal 11-118, in a paper upon the thunderstones of Java, the objects are called wedges and not axes. Our notion is that rustics and savages call wedge-shaped objects that fall from the sky axes, that scientific men, when it suits their purposes, can resist temptations to prolixity and pedantry and adopt the simple, that they can be intelligible when derisive. Of all which lands us in a confusion, worse, I think, than we were in before, we so satisfactorily emerge from the distresses of butter and blood and ink and paper and punk and silk. It's now cannonballs and axes and discs, if a lapstone be a disc. It's a flat stone at any rate. A great many scientists are good impressionists. They snub the impertinences of details. Had he been of a coarse, grubbing nature, I think Dr. Botting could never have so simply and beautifully explained the occurrence of stone wedges in tree trunks. But to a realist, the story would be something like this. A man who needed a tree in a land of jungles where, for some unknown reason, everyone's very selfish with his trees, conceives that hammering stone wedges makes less noise than does the chopping of wood. He and his descendants, in a course of many years, cut down trees with wedges, and escape penalty, because it would never occur to a prosecutor that the head of an axe is a wedge. The story is like every other attempted positivism, beautiful and complete, until we see what it excludes or disregards, whereupon it becomes the ugly and incomplete, but not absolutely, because there is probably something of what is called foundation for it. Perhaps a mentally incomplete Santal did once do something of the kind. Story told to Dr. Botting. In the usual scientific way, he makes a dogma of an aberration. Or we did have to utter a little stress upon this matter after all. They're so hairy and attractive, these scientists of the 19th century, we feel the zeal of a Sitting Bull when we think of their scalps. We shall have to have an expression of our own upon this confusing subject. We have expressions, we don't call them explanations, we've discarded explanations, with beliefs. Though everyone who scalps is, in the oneness of allness, himself likely to be scalped, there is such a discourtesy to an enemy as the wearing of wigs. Cannonballs and wedges and what they mean. Bombardments of this earth. Attempts to communicate. Or visitors to this earth long ago, explorers from the moon, taking back with them, as curiosities perhaps, implements of this earth's prehistoric inhabitants. A wreck, a cargo of such things held for ages in suspension in the Super Sargasso Sea, falling or shaken down occasionally by storms. But by preponderance of description we cannot accept that thunderstones ever were attached to handles, or are prehistoric axes. As to attempts to communicate with this earth by means of wedge-shaped objects, especially adapted to the penetration of a vast gelatinous area spread around this earth, in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy, 9-337, there is an account of a stone wedge that fell from the sky near Cashel, Tipperary, August 2nd, 1865. The phenomenon is not questioned, but the orthodox preference is to call it not axe-like nor wedge-shaped, but pyramidal. For data of other pyramidal stones said to have fallen from the sky, see the report of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, 1861-34. One fell at Segowlee, Indiana, March 6, 1853. Of the object that fell at Cashel, Dr. Haughton says in the proceedings, a singular feature is observable in this stone, that I have never seen in any other. The rounded edges of the pyramid are sharply marked by lines on the black crust, as perfect as if made by a ruler. Dr. Haughton's idea is that the marks may have been made by some peculiar tension in the cooling. It must have been very peculiar, if in all aerolites not wedge-shaped, no such phenomenon had ever been observed. It merges away with one or two instances known. After Dr. Haughton's time of seeming stratification in meteorites. Stratification in meteorites, however, is denied by the faithful. I begin to suspect something else. A whopper is coming. Later, it will be as reasonable by familiarity as anything else ever said. If someone should study the stone of Cashel as Champollion studied the Rosetta Stone, he might, or rather would inevitably, find meaning in those lines and translate them into English. Nevertheless, I begin to suspect something else, something more subtle and esoteric than graven characters upon stones that have fallen from the sky in attempts to communicate. The notion that other worlds are attempting to communicate with this world is widespread. My own notion is that it is not an attempt at all, that it was achievement centuries ago. I should like to send out a report that a thunderstone had fallen, say, somewhere in New Hampshire, and keep track of every person who came to examine that stone, trace down his affiliations, keep track of them. Then send out a report that a thunderstone had fallen at Stockholm, say. Would one of the persons who had gone to New Hampshire be met again in Stockholm? But what if he had no anthropological, lapidarian, or meteorological affiliations, but did belong to a secret society? It is only a dawning credulity. Of the three forms of symmetric objects that have, or haven't, fallen from the sky, it seems to me that the disk is the most striking. So far, in this respect, we have been at our worst. Possibly that's pretty bad, but lapstones are likely to be of considerable variety of form, and something that is said to have fallen at some time somewhere in the Dutch West Indies is profoundly of the unchosen. Now we shall have something that is high up in the castes of the accursed. Comptus Rendus, 1887-182, that upon June 20th, 1887, in a violent storm, 2 months before the reported fall of the symmetric iron object of Brixton, a small stone had fallen from the sky at Tarbes, France, 13 millimeters in diameter, 5 millimeters thick, weight 2 grams. Reported to the French Academy by M. Soudre, professor of the Normal School, Tarbes. This time the old convenience, there in the first place, is too greatly resisted. The stone was covered with ice. This object had been cut and shaped by means similar to human hands and human mentality. It was a disc of worked stone, très régulier. Il a été assurément travaillé. There's not a word as to any known whirlwind anywhere. Nothing of other objects or debris that fell at or near the state in France. The thing had fallen alone, but as mechanically as any part of a machine responds to its stimulus, the explanation appears in Compte Rendu that this stone had been raised by a whirlwind and then flung down. It may be that in the whole 19th century no event more important than this occurred. In La Nature, 1887, and in L'Année Scientifique, 1887, this occurrence is noted. It is mentioned in one of the summer numbers of Nature, 1887. Fassig lists a paper upon it in the Annuaire de Société Météorologique, 1887. Not a word of discussion, not a subsequent mention I can find. In our own expression, what matters it how we, the French Academy, or the Salvation Army may explain? A disc of worked stone fell from the sky at Tarbes, France, June 20th, 1887.